On July 22nd, 1974, diabetic Peter Chaffe left his friend's house in the Auckland suburb of Avondale and got into his bright red car to head home. It should have been a journey of some 20 minutes, but Peter never reached his destination. What happened to him that night, and how could both he and his car vanish without trace?
He was very much somebody that enjoyed the outdoors. I remember him always being down the back attacking the gorse. You know, he was on a property that he had been wanting all his life. He worked at a fantastic place. He was doing the job he liked. He enjoyed his work. He wasn't working for work, he enjoyed his work. When somebody disappears, the implications of them going on the family, especially if they're the sole provider at the time, is massive. My mother's never married again. She never forgets him. She still thinks she's married to him. You know, she's been unwell of late, but no, she's not forgotten him. That's what she said.
It leaves echoes in a lot of your life. Every time they find a body, you think, is this it? Yeah, it's not a thing you can comfortably bury. Yeah, it's always there.
The strangest thing, I've only cried once. I like being in control, and I didn't expect to do this.
Peter Chaffe was born in England in 1931. Intelligent and sociable, he studied at the Imperial College in London, marrying Dorothy in 1954. 9 years later, they migrated to New Zealand with their children, Judith and Tim.
They came from the centre of London, and they had this love of the country. They just had a passion for, you know, growing stuff and dealing with animals. Yeah, that's really where his passion seemed to be, and they worked really well together doing that. They did all sorts of things, from, you know, preserves through slaughtering their own animals, growing their own produce. You know, the garden was huge. It was a massive garden, yeah, much sort of like the size of a house.
Childhood sweethearts who'd stayed that way pretty well, from what I understood. I think people worked a little bit more on their relationships and were prepared to endure a bit more, but I wouldn't have said it was a household under stress.
Peter worked as chief technician in the chemistry department at Auckland University, where he was well liked.
I think he was fairly well looked up to, yes, by both the academics and the technical staff. He seemed to be able to bridge it quite well, in that he had friends in, you know, both areas, and quite highly regarded in some aspects.
He was one of the first people I met when I came into the department. His office was directly opposite mine, and we both worked with our doors open so we could actually talk to each other across the corridor. Peter was a very open and almost in-your-face Englishman. He didn't stand on ceremony as far as anyone was concerned. We were all the same to him, and I regarded him as one of the more friendly and open people and easy to deal with people around the university.
Peter's relationships with his workmates extended well beyond the university.
There were a great group of mates there. They seemed very supportive of him. He had, you know, a great many jokes and other things. And yeah, I worked there as a school kid and a student, and they all seemed to enjoy themselves.
I mean, back in those days, the culture was, the 6 o'clock drinking across the road. The Kiwi Tavern was a pretty popular spot, and it was quite common, obviously, for people to go across after work and have a few beers.
Very often on the weekends, I'd join him and a few other of my colleagues from the department, and we'd go to Eden Park and watch a rep rugby match. Peter was invariably the leader of the pack in setting these things up.
But 18 months before his disappearance, Peter's health began to suffer.
We used to play squash about once a week. Peter was the ideal partner for me because we were equally incompetent. After one game, he was puffing and panting and a fair bit of distress, and I went over to him and I got close enough so I could smell his breath, and I could smell acetone on his breath, and that is a symptom of diabetes. So when we went back to the department, I told them to fill up a test tube with a urine sample, and I told them how to test it. And it did test for glucose in the urine.
I knew he was unwell. I saw him getting thinner, but that was about it. There's a photo I took of him. He was really thin in that photo. When Mum and I were looking through it, she said, yes, that's what it did to him. It made him very, very thin.
Initially, they attempted control by diet and tablets, which wasn't overly successful. He was fairly unstable, and eventually he went on to insulin. I can remember him saying he was going to beat it, and diabetes is the thing you live with. You don't beat it, you just manage it as well as you possibly can.
The regime he had to go through was 5 injections a day. My mother used to have to make sandwiches, and his to count the calories and the energy levels that the food was giving him and monitor it every day, every week.
But on Monday, July the 22nd, 1974, Peter Chaffe inexplicably changed his routine.
On the day he disappeared, he actually told Mum not to do the lunch, and he'd take care of it, and we think that's what got him into trouble.
Peter left for work, his family unaware that would be the last time they would ever see him. On Monday the 22nd of July 1974, diabetic Peter Chaffe spent the morning working at Auckland University. Then he met his colleague Duncan McLennan for one of their regular games of squash.
After he got onto his medication, that we'd had very few problems, and we'd gone back to our 50-50, you win, I win sort of thing. But this time, this day was markedly different. I'd been keeping an eye on him during the game, and it was obvious that he was in far more distress than usual. He was so bad on that day that we actually had to give up. We normally played for an hour, and I think we gave up after about 40 to 45 minutes.
Peter was exhausted and complained about being out of breath. But after a cup of tea, he seemed to recover, and after work joined Tony Serra across the road at the pub. Later, as was their custom, Peter prepared to drop Tony home.
Him and Tony were standing by the car chatting, and he said he was still feeling a little bit queasy. He was worried. He wasn't his normal, happy self.
Peter continued to deteriorate on the drive home. He complained of double vision and kept stopping several car lengths behind traffic. By the time he got to the Serra's house in Avondale, Tony and his wife were very worried. They managed to persuade Peter to eat a couple of biscuits, but he washed these down with a whiskey.
They weren't happy with the condition of Peter, his sort of physical state, and possibly even his mental state in terms of how he was feeling, and they wanted to take him home. They were trying to convince him to leave his car at my parents' place, and they would drop him home, and they could either drop him off in the morning or he could come and collect it. But he was insistent that he was fine and that he would drive home.
The Sarahs bade Peter goodbye about 6:25 p.m, but not before making him promise to ring them when he got home.
From talking to Mum and Dad, he did turn right at the top. So from Craddock Street, he'd have turned right into Blockhouse Bay, which would have been the normal standard way to go down to Waterview and go onto the Northwestern to go home.
Peter should have taken around 20 minutes to get from Craddock Street in Avondale to his home in Red Hills Road, Massey. But by 7 p.m, over half an hour later, there had been no word from him. So the Sarahs and Dorothy started searching along the route Peter should have taken. There was no sign of him or his distinctive red Simca. Then they called the police.
For me, it was hazy. You know, I was an 11-year-old. Remember going to bed and then being woken up about 11 and Dad wasn't home. Mum saying that there's something wrong and they're looking for him, and told me to go back to sleep. It was just a whirl. Lots of people coming and going. I do remember the police coming in, lots of conversations.
Duncan McLennan was at home listening to the news that night.
They said a man has not arrived home from work. He lives in the Massey area, and I think I have joked to Candy, oh, it looks as if I really drove Peter into the ground today, if it is him, and we laughed at that, and then suddenly they mentioned his name. And that, of course, was horrifying.
There was no sign of Peter that night or the next morning. When news of his disappearance reached the university, his friends and colleagues, knowing his medical condition, were gravely concerned for his welfare.
I can recall a police officer coming in and meeting with us at the chemistry department, and there was a general feeling amongst the technical staff that we had to try and do something as well. So we were already thinking about trying to form some sort of coordinated search.
At the time, I was the staff senior sergeant. I was the senior NCO, and I was a supervisor when I received information about Mr. Chaffe not arriving at home. I arranged for a ground search party to check the full length of the motorway right up to the home.
We first off looked at hospitals, car parks, also traversed the route that he was likely to take home, and tried to visualise any divergence of that route as well.
I can recall us all carpooling and driving out and dropping ourselves off at various points along the Northwestern, pretty much from the Waterview on-ramp, where in theory he should have gone on, out to Royal Road and beyond to where the motorway ended down where Westgate is now.
They then organised foot parties with groups of people, and we combed the Northwestern motorway all the way by foot, both sides, and went and sent foot parties into areas around Massey, through to Waitakere, and particularly areas where there was a lot of vegetation and that.
The other part of it was individual searches where some of us just got out in our cars and drove around the scenic drive in the Waitakere Ranges, sort of thinking somehow you'd see where he'd gone off the road and you'd be able to say, I've found Peter. You know, it's that kind of almost comic book approach, I suppose. I suppose it sounds a bit corny now, but you wanted to try and do something. You wanted to try and see if you could find him.
And we'd go down, me and the wife and whoever else was sitting in the car, and we did all those back roads. We went right over Waitakere, places like Black Ridge Road, which was quite desolate in those days. And we didn't zoom along. They were okay, some of them were narrow roads. You went along slowly and you looked at the edge of the road in case there was any sign of somebody going off, and we never found a thing.
Searchers covered an enormous amount of ground, out to Auckland's west coast beaches, south to Taupō, east across to Thames, and as far north as Waipu. 2 planes were also deployed.
No, nothing. And then, of course, we probably foolishly actually widened our area. We would, drive around. But, for months afterwards, whenever you went anywhere.
On the surface of it, it seemed Peter had just vanished into thin air.
The Waitakeries these days are everyone's playground. There's a lot of people walking through them. The whole country's a lot more populated. It'd be easy enough for one man to disappear, but a man in a bright red car?
I've been involved in many searches and supervised many searches over the years before that. And there's always been an answer. It's a complete mystery to me. It always has been.
In 1974, 43-year-old Peter Chaffe vanished on the drive home from work. A concentrated inquiry failed to turn up either Peter or his red car. 35 years later, his disappearance remains a mystery.
Through and figure out the most likely things that would have happened.
So now we've asked search and rescue experts Ross Gordon and Roscoe Tate to join with the original search organiser Peter Selwyn in revisiting the case.
The research and analysis.
If they can understand exactly who Peter was and work through the events that day, that could explain what happened to him.
So we're talking 30-odd years ago.
So that's where your role's going to be absolutely critical in doing that.
Okay, he was very, very popular. He enjoyed sports.
Right.
He went out of his way to sort of make friends within the department.
Conservative?
I think possibly he was a bit conservative.
So was he making the effort to integrate with the New Zealand?
Yes, very much so. Very much so.
Okay. So as part of this, did he get involved with drinking, the social follow-up to some of the sports?
There was a little bit of social drinking now and again, particularly when we played a little bit of bowls with other firms. And that included cross-sectional
off-work work discussion.
Off-work discussion, yeah.
So what about work pressures and stresses here? And around that particular time that Peter went missing.
I think that particular day he was probably under quite a bit of pressure. Yeah. Normally he had lunch with a small group of us every day, and if I remember right, that day he just came down for a cup of tea.
And there were times, like any job, where you get a bit down about your job and you don't particularly like it, and there's aspects of it that you don't overly enjoy. But on the whole, my impressions of him were that he liked what he did, and he liked the people he worked with, and he wouldn't want to do anything underhand or drastic like committing suicide.
Was there any other impressions that you gained from him at work?
We liked him. The academic staff liked him as well too.
That's just coming through so strong, isn't it? One, it's been listed up there first. It's coming through down here, down here, and outgoing. Yeah. This is not the picture of a person who's withdrawing from work, who's withdrawing from people at all.
I couldn't picture him willfully going missing, disappearing, because there's no reason to think so. He seemed to be reasonably settled at home. There's no discord there in the family home that I could think of.
I never gave any credence at all to the idea that he might have either topped himself or wandered off on purpose. I mean, he just wasn't that sort of guy.
While most people dismissed the theory Peter had begun a new life, there are those to this day who are convinced it's a possibility. 24 hours after he disappeared, there was an apparent break in the case. Peter was seemingly spotted alive.
I was 16. I was in my first job. We had just gone to the Red Fox Tavern in Maramarua. He came in for a meal. I remember where he sat. He was wearing very dark clothing. I remember looking at him from the lounge bar. His head was down. He was definitely acting a bit strange. I did try to wake him up at one stage. The next day, around morning tea time, I was sitting in the wholesale area and had the Herald open, and we saw his photo. And I remember saying, this guy was in here last night. Dad was the manager at the Red Fox. We had been there since May that year. He did make a statement to the police that he did see the gentleman and that he did see me talking to him, serving him. He was a policeman for a long time, extremely good at details. So he would have known what he was talking about.
But while 4 staff at the Red Fox Tavern agreed they'd seen Peter, not one noticed a bright red, very distinctive-looking vehicle in the car park. The one thing which may have distinguished whether this person in the pub really was Peter.
Memory is one of the oldest areas of psychological science, and what we've known for over 100 years is that memory fades very rapidly. You lose the bulk of memory very rapidly within 24 hours. It doesn't mean that you can't remember things 24 hours after that, but you'll see a rapid period of decline and fading of detail. So there's a man in the pub, and when you gain access to information the next day on the news or in the newspaper, or there's a picture of the guy who's missing. And now it's fairly easy, especially if they have some similarity, it's fairly easy for someone to say, that was the guy who was in the pub last night. And what'll happen is that person's face from the newspaper, the missing man, can actually be grafted in your memory onto the head of the person who was in the pub the night before. And that's what you see.
It is normal when people go missing and you advertise it universally for people to phone through possible sightings, which normally are not correct. But you've got to check them out. And that was done.
But Peter could have had a reason to be passing through Maramarua. He often travelled that way to see an old boss in Hamilton.
We had regular trips down there to play social cricket between the chemistry department at the university and a Waikato 11. So he obviously still had a close relationship with his former boss. That would have been the way he'd have driven down. He used to take the back way to bring you out in Hamilton near the university.
But if that was his destination, Peter never made it.
I do believe that someone swiped that car in some way for some reason, and that the car and Peter were separated.
Search experts trying to work through the disappearance of Peter Chaffe 35 years ago are deeply puzzled by one aspect of the case. It's easy to hide a man, but how can a car simply vanish?
Over the years, I've come to the conclusion that somehow or another there must have somebody else involved with him, and that there was some form of foul play. He's not the sort of bloke who would disappear on purpose. I mean, I just can't imagine it. And for the car never to have been found, as well as him, somebody else must have been involved, I feel. I really do.
It could be that you have what we call a compounding scenario where he might have gone missing, become separated from his car, and then later on the car's stolen, or he may have become the subject of crime there. So it'd be a compounding situation. But the research tells us in those initial stages, the likelihood of a crime is very, very, very low.
There's nothing to suggest he'd been murdered or come to any harm illegally. The last person to see him alive, of course, was his friend, so we had to accept his word. I had no reason to not to accept his word. They're good friends, and I can't think of any reason why he should come to any harm by any criminal act at all.
It probably would have been 3 weeks to a month after Peter disappeared. And I'd come out of the car park at the university, and on the right-hand side outside the Student Union is a red Simca, just parked there on the side of the road. I mean, I nearly crashed my car. I got such a fright because I saw the number plate and it was FH7201. But the first part of the plate I saw was FH72. And I thought it was Peter's car because it was a red Simca, identical model, but it was one number out for the last number.
It's just very strange that, and it was an unusual make, one of the first Asian imported models. Weren't many of them around.
According to police records, less than 400 Simcas have been registered in New Zealand. To try and find Peter Chaffe's Simca, we contacted wreckers nationwide and also placed advertisements on the internet and in several publications. After several false leads, we're alerted to a wrecker's yard in Dannevirke. Buried in among 6 hectares of abandoned wrecks is a very rare find. Simca fanatic Colin Smith has discovered an identical make and model to Peter's car.
Well, see, this is a mystery. There's white there, but it's black there. Now, if it was a red car, genuinely original, it'd be red right through. I just took that chrome strip off and it's white under there as well. So what were they hiding? See this here? All the rubbers have been painted over again. It looks red, but when you paint a car, you don't paint all the rubbers.
Colin, who's collected Simcas since the 1970s, thinks there's something very odd about this car. He wonders if it's been in a crash and someone's tried to offload it illegally.
Well, it seems to me like it was a hurried hide paint job. Must have been a jack-up to sell off at some stage. I must have had a hit in the left rear corner. Bad enough to replace the engine cover and the inner panel. And that's a serious crash. Could have gone down the bank stern first, yeah. It's possible. But you'd have to be a pretty bad driver to tip one of them down the bank stern first.
He was quite diabolical driving it on the metal roads because it was a, I can't remember how it works, I think it was a rear engine car. And so if you drive those on metal roads, they hang out awfully. My sister remembers being terrified by us driving on that.
So could this Simca be Peter Chaffe's? It no longer has its plates, but we are able to locate the chassis number. A check reveals that it's very close to Peter's. The first 5 letters and numbers are identical. But that's where the similarity ends, and we eventually discover this car was registered to Invercargill.
I've continually thought about it, the events, all the time. What could we have done? And now, even after I retired, I went back working temporary for the police for 7 years on a temporary basis. I still ask a bit about it and puzzle about it, and always check the number of the car. That's the best hope, is locating the car.
And the quest to find the car is about to become even more complicated for our investigative team, which now has to factor in Peter's medical state. As a diabetic, regular food intake was vital for survival. Yet it's unclear whether he had breakfast the day he'd disappeared, and he'd almost certainly skipped another meal.
Lunch he normally had with a small group of us.
Yes.
And that day he breezed in a little bit later, said he was going to play squash, and just had a cup of tea.
Cup of tea only?
He wasn't quite as himself in his attitude to things on that
Taking that a
lunchtime.
bit further, would he have had easy access to food? Was there a cafeteria, snack bar? Would he have kept something
He
in the
would have
store?
to go to a student union for the nearest...
so you'd have to make a conscious effort.
You have to go outside the apartment to get something to eat.
Then he played squash.
When he was initially playing, it wasn't too bad, but then his condition started to deteriorate.
So he's off his game.
He didn't collapse or anything like that, but on occasions he just needed to lean against one of the walls of the squash court for perhaps 20, 30 seconds just to get his breath back. He wasn't disorientated in any way. It was just a question of lack of stamina.
In the last 30 years, there have been significant advances in medical understanding of diabetes and how Peter might have been suffering.
If he had maintained his insulin levels, and if he had expended quite a lot of energy playing squash, as I hear he did, then potentially he's got the sort of recipe for a hypo and for driving himself to low blood sugar levels.
When this hypoglycemia becomes a little worse, we get what are called neuroglycopenic symptoms, which means the brain's not getting enough sugar and brain function's affected. And that can manifest itself as confusion, blank look, odd reactions and slow reaction times, drowsiness, and sometimes emotions, excitement, anger sometimes, but then drifting from that into more of a state of drowsiness and then a loss of consciousness at its worst. So that can come on reasonably quickly. It can come on a bit more gradually.
And so then after that he went to the pub.
So double vision came in, and they didn't actually want him to drive. So if we take that overall trend, you've just got a downhill trend there of his performance and health and well-being, and it's just compounding all the way through.
Let's assume that this is a low blood sugar level. He was on the state of imminent collapse at any time. It could have happened in the afternoon. It could have happened early evening at his friend's house, and it could have happened while he drove. And of course, the scenario that comes to mind is that he continued to drive some distance and then lost consciousness somewhere, and the car has veered off somewhere.
Investigators looking into the disappearance of diabetic Peter Chaffe 35 years ago believe he may have been hypoglycemic the day he vanished. He had been exercising, had consumed very little food, and had drunk alcohol, a recipe for catastrophe.
You finish up being very disoriented because that's the moment before the brain says, I'm turning off and we're going into a coma.
If Peter was hypoglycemic and heading towards a coma, he would have been completely unaware of the danger he was in when he got into his car.
In his mind, he might have well been saying, I'm doing everything perfectly normally and rationally. But others might have observed something different. And some of the symptoms, like pulling up way ahead of the lights and so on, sort of smack of the sorts of things one might expect from somebody who's already in a situation where the mind isn't fully in control of the body.
We have had people set off from, say, a town here or a suburb, ended up driving in completely the opposite direction, arriving 30 to 45 minutes later, not knowing quite where they were, and then, so I think the answer to the question is it is easily possible that Peter was driving in one direction that everybody thought he was driving in, and veered and ended up in another direction and driven a considerable distance.
With a Simca capable of approximately 450 kilometres to the tank, that means Peter could have effectively ended up almost anywhere in the upper half of the North Island, something the original searchers considered.
And that was how we brought in the trucking firms, bus services, taxis, camping grounds, anybody we could get in contact to give us some sort of feedback or information.
That was good thinking.
Basically, I'd say your search area that you're getting reports from was basically that sort of area.
That's right.
Yeah, which is quite a considerable area when you think about it in terms of the number of roads.
So if we just do a ballpark figure, say that was 200 kilometres long, 200 kilometres wide, that equals 40,000 square kilometres. Now, if we change that into square metres, that's 40... I don't know how many that is, but that's one awful lot of square metres. And the car only needed 4 or 5 square metres to be in. So that, that's just absolutely huge.
Well, what we really haven't got in this case is any clues about direction of travel, apart from the fact that at the end of Craddock Street, he was indicating to turn right. That's the only clue we've got. So in terms of trying to set up a search pattern, in terms of where to actually go and look, is actually quite difficult in this case.
There's a very high probability that in circumstances like this, even if he was suffering from some sort of medical condition, that he's going to try and get home. It's an instinctive type of thing to do. So if we take this one, if you can imagine lots and lots and lots and lots of probability or chance of finding him is actually along that road, more so than on one of these others.
The search investigators have decided the best chance of finding Peter is to look along the road he lived on, Red Hills Road in Massey. After comparing the terrain from 1974, they zero in on an area which has never been developed.
We just go down to the fence line and sweep back round to those tea trees over there.
Okay, well, we'll just drop into this area first and get people off the road a little bit. John, you want to start the way down? Okay, watch your footing there.
Several sections of dense bush have been identified as possible places Peter Chaffe and his Simca could have drifted off the road and been swallowed by their surroundings.
We just found a car seat, red car seat down here, could be from the missing vehicle. Just taking a grid reference and marking its position on the GPS. Righty, another find down here.
The reality is there's no other car around it. The engine should be in the car. So what we'll do is if you can note it on the GPS, and if need be, we can come back to it.
Graveyard for junk. Engine up here as well. So you see any structures though? The structure, you've got tractor tyres here as well. Probably an old Jeep or something perhaps. There's a lot of car parts in this area, chrome, rusted axles, and we've got this area here which is mainly brambles though, and you tend to walk over the top of it, and there's deadfall trees which are over the fence. So the thing is, we could be standing above something and not realise it, so this could be a hot spot as well.
How intact was the chrome?
That was in pretty good nick.
So we've got the scientific explanation that the chrome from 74 is unlikely to still be around. Okay.
Yeah.
Axles?
Really rusted through.
Yeah.
Not very large axles. I don't know the vehicle properly, so that's why it could be a little bit of an interest point there.
Okay, was there any other engine parts that you found down there?
Yeah, there was other engine parts. There was also another full-size engine pour.
The two engine blocks we found were in very poor condition, but they're both water-cooled. I wouldn't recondition them. They're way past it.
With no conclusive discoveries, the team head further down Red Hills Road.
Try and keep your line. So you start dropping off to your left a little bit, Laurie. Shuffle over a bit, Paul, then. If he starts dropping down, you can drop down. That means everyone moves over a bit. Just watch your distancing. You drop down a bit to your left, Laurie. Paul, you can drop down. Ralph, you can drop down a bit. Yes, a windscreen, that one. There's nothing else around here though, eh?
Throughout the day, the searchers have made several finds, but after thoroughly checking them out, none can be connected to the missing sinker.
Nobody's seen Peter Chaffe, nobody's seen the car. So in terms of applying search logic to it, we don't have a starting point.
Just watch your foot in and watch those rocks at the top.
And the car could have been driven hundreds of kilometres with the petrol that was potentially in the tank, and hundreds of kilometres of roads and lanes and backcountry area would take years and years and years to look at.
I think in a situation like this, you're never confident that you've covered everything. You can't be. And I think that's the thing that worries you, well, forever really, that you searched, you felt to your best ability, and it wasn't enough.
Dad lived probably another 10 or 12 years after Peter's disappearance, and he never ever got over that. Until the day Mum died, which was at 90, you know, probably nearly 30 years after Peter disappeared. She'd say, you know, poor old Tony, you know, he went to his grave always wondering what happened to Peter.
After his disappearance, I very rarely played squash again, and within a short time I just stopped playing altogether. I used to play with some other colleagues in the department, but the games were pretty unsatisfactory because, firstly, most of them were far better than me and neither of us got the workout we were looking for. But secondly, every time I was on a squash court, I could only see Peter there in my mind, and sometimes this left me quite distressed after a game, and I thought this is not the way I should feel when I'm indulging in recreation. And I would say within 6 months I never played another game of squash again.
Yeah, a lot of people were concerned about him and put time and energy into talking about it and theorising and stuff, and they still ask, you know, did anything happen as they found him? Did you ever get any answers? And you have to shrug your shoulders and they say no, you know. And they say, well, how can that happen? Well, it does.
You just have to get on. You just have to do what you can and live. And things don't stop just because someone's gone.